What's your Inc. ranking this year, David?
Well, we were number 9 overall, and we were number 1 in IT and number 1 in New England.
Well, that's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So, David, the question that I really have for you is not just how you manage the revenue growth, but how do you manage the company in terms of your needs for people, and how do you hire the right talent? That execution and delivery is really hard. Many people fail over there.
You know, I sort of view there's 3 parts to my job as CEO. One is building the team. Number 2 is setting the strategy. And number 3 is making sure that the company has enough capital to operate, and so raising money, basically. You know, on the building the team front, you know, we've been very fortunate. I mean, one of the benefits of growing fast and being kind of a hot company in New England is you're kind of the place that everybody wants to work. So I do believe that, you know, we were able to attract some people who probably, you know, we would not have been able to attract had we not, you know, been such a sort of a hot property in the New England market. So, you know, we get a lot of publicity, and obviously the numbers, you know, are attractive. So, because we pretty much pull new people out of some very good companies to come to work here. So, I have to say, you know, in terms of picking good people, you know, we have a process now that is pretty exhaustive. So if we're hiring a new VP, first of all, we have a really good recruiter who has now worked with the company for over 2 years, really knows the management team, knows the company. So even though, you know, it's hard to pay the fees to a recruiter, if you have a really good recruiter, it's definitely worthwhile, especially for very senior level people. And then the second thing is we go through a pretty rigorous process of interviewing with literally all the other VPs. So, you know, we've recently hired a VP and general manager for our business to business group. We hired a new VP for customer support, which is a very big job. It's you know, probably 40% of all the employees in the company work in that division. And you know, right now we're recruiting a new VP of marketing. So because the former VP of marketing has moved up to be general manager of the consumer division. So a lot of change in the management team in a fairly short period of time. And then it was probably maybe 4 months ago, we recruited a new VP of product. So, you know, to run the product management function at Carbonite. So quite a lot of change in the management team in a short period of time, which, you know, is a little scary in itself. But the fact that everybody went through a very exhaustive, at least exhaustive enough that they all complained about it, process of interviewing. Because, you know, it's very important that the team work together well, and that everybody regards the other guy as at least their equal. So, I mean, it's like, you know, if you're recruiting people to be on a pro football team or something like that, you can't have somebody who's weak. You know, everybody has to look at the guy next to him and say, that guy is awesome. He's, you know, he's the best. You know, he's the best at the position that he's playing.
Other senior executives who are hiring people tend to cut down on costs for a variety of reasons. And some of them might be against or averse to the idea of paying a lot of money to recruiters or going through an exhaustive process, which is time consuming and resource intensive.
Well, I've made those mistakes in the past, you know, where we've kind of done a shortcut job of recruiting senior people, and you know, have just lived to regret it. And it's the kind of mistake that really can, I don't know if you could say it could destroy your company, but it could come close to it. So I've just learned to be extremely careful about it and not to resent the fees that the headhunter charges. And I think, if you can build a relationship with a good recruiter, that person becomes almost like an extension of your team, because if you're growing, at least if you're growing as fast as Carbonite is, there's almost a continuous stream of work for an outside recruiter. That person will get to know the company and the management team, and will get better and better at presenting you with candidates who they are already pretty convinced will fit in. And that saves a lot of time in itself. So by the time I get to interview somebody, the recruiter has already made, pretty good judgment as to whether this is somebody who I would want to talk to. And so I personally feel like the process has worked well for us. And I didn't waste a lot of time interviewing people who were clearly unqualified. I spent all my time interviewing people who it was, which one is the best of all of these really good candidates. That's kind of what it came down to.
Now, David, last you mentioned that in your previous experiences, you learned by making a mistake and by failing. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those mistakes? Why did you think you didn't want to go through this process or engage a recruiter? The kind of experiences that others are currently perhaps going through.
Well, you mentioned the two reasons why people sometimes shortcut that process. One is the money. Typically a recruiter will charge 30 or 35% or something like that of the salary of the person that's being recruited, and the other is the time. It's very time consuming to spend an hour or 2 hours with a candidate, then you've got 4 or 5 candidates lined up. Your whole week can be gone before you know it. So that's the reasons I, in the past, didn't pay enough attention to this. But the results might be that you hire somebody who, once you get to know them, is a friction point in the organization. Maybe their resume is good. They've done the kind of things that you're asking them to do before, but they just get to the table and they butt heads with the other people. They got a different style. Maybe they came from a company where the CEO was a very authoritarian kind of guy who had all the strings. And here, the management process is very collaborative and consensus driven. That's just the way I like to run my company. But we did make the mistake of bringing in a couple of people early on who I think were more conditioned to an authoritarian style of management, and they didn't function in a company where I'm constantly trying to seek consensus.
So you probably have had the same situation. Resources are always limited. Should I assume that you had, at some point at least in one company or the other that you have dealt with in the past, that you had resource limitation and you went through a process of thinking, what should I do?
Yeah, you're always looking at that, and you're saying, gee, would I rather spend that money on a recruiter, or would I rather spend that money on an R&D project or a marketing budget or something else? And I guess the question is, what are you trying to achieve? So if you're trying to double the size of your company every year, that's a management challenge, and you can't get there unless you can really execute well. And you can't execute well unless you've got good people to do it. So it's sort of like, you might get lucky and hire somebody on the cheap who turns out to be great, but the likelihood is that that's a bad bet. And if you spend the money on the marketing campaign and not on the person, you'll grow an incremental amount, but you're not going to be able to grow double in size, let's say, because as you double in size, you need to broaden the management. The bench depth on the management team has got to grow. So, the mistake you can make is you could spend the money on the management team, and then the company doesn't grow, in which case you're screwed, because everybody's going to be unhappy. The company isn't growing. Really good people will start to leave. But if you don't hire those people, you're guaranteed not to grow, you know? I mean, things will fall apart. A lot of companies get to a certain size, they can't manage the growth, things start to be inefficient, you know, customer support goes to pieces, and you know, the next thing you know, your company is all ragged, and you go up and then you come down.
So how do you manage your cash flow? What do you plan that you need to have at least 6 months, a year down the line? What's the process that you go through in your mind?
Well, for our 2011 budget, let's say, I have a pretty good feeling for how many people I'm going to need to recruit to be able to manage the growth for the current year. And I put in the budget, I put in a certain amount for recruiter fees. And now we just also brought on an in-house recruiter for sort of mid-level and lower-level people. But, you know, I wouldn't use that person necessarily for recruiting a VP level person, because the breadth of contacts and the ability to know, you know, who's who in all the different companies around in New England, for example. That's something which, you know, you got to be an independent headhunter out there networking all the time to be able to do that. So I just budget it in, and I look at the other expenses that are out there, and I try to arrive at a reasonable figure. I say, okay, you know, I should be spending this much for R&D. I should be spending this much for marketing, and it's an issue of balancing the risk of not doing it against you know, the expense. So everything is a balancing act, and you try to model these things, and you try to say, okay, what if I spend more over here but less over there? You know, maybe I gain a little bit, but I increase the risk, and so you balance these things out. I think that's what most companies do with it, but you've got to put a line item in there for recruiting expenses. If you don't, you're fooling yourself.
That's wonderful.